from the book, and I do have some questions that we can kind of go over. But before we do that, I wanted to open it up, and feel free to turn your camera back on if you want to, and unmute yourself. But if anybody wanted to start by just saying, sharing one or two things that kind of really stood out to you about the novel.
Hey, I'm Jessica.
Hey, Jessica.
So, one of the things, it was the way that there was, it wasn't really like up for discussion that someone was going to care for the grandmother as she got older. Everybody kind of knew that it was their role, and it should, and the way they went about deciding who would have her at what times. I thought that was a really good example of multi-generational families. And I really liked that aspect of not only seeing, it was almost like watching three generations of women in this book instead of just the main character.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Again, that the whole family dynamics really stood out to me. Even though Josephine was, I think, kind of ahead of her time in some ways, and very was not your typical woman at that point in time, as far as like abiding by society standards. But they did still have that really strong family relationship, and again, yeah, caring for each other and the older folks in their families. Anybody else want to speak to that or something else that stood out to you?
Hi, this is Carrie. On that same topic, is actually 4 generations, because you had her daughters playing into it as well, up to her grandmother. And the other thing I found really interesting was the role of women and how much things just haven't changed. We like to think they have, but they really haven't. As far as society's expectations and how we're treated when you go into business or try to take on what somebody might consider a man's role.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things I think is interesting is just as women, what do they call it? Like the kind of like the silent, the mental load, or the silent, just the certain things that women take care of without, I think for us, not even thinking about it a lot of times, keeping up with everybody's birthdays, or, the housework, or you're planning of vacations, or that kind of thing. So yeah, so that extra piece that women take on a lot of times, that a lot of times men don't have. So yeah, anybody else on that topic? Anybody else want to share something that stood out to you?
It's Jessica again.
Hey, Jessica.
But I thought it was really unique to see how his passing kind of offered a little bit of protection for his family, even though she wasn't afforded any of, like, the respect and the dignity we would like to seen her given. There were certain times that he was able to use his passing for the benefit of the community. For example, when they rode through the picnic area and destroyed it, the officer immediately tuned in to Sweetie and was able to actually did something about it, actually even investigated it. And it was due to him passing for white. But I also thought it was interesting that we didn't see any of the extremism of racism for them being a interracial couple at this time. So it was almost or it wasn't discussed, because we would see that, like, CW would make remarks about her wearing the pants, but never about Sweetie getting persecuted for choosing to be with an African American woman, since that he was considered a Caucasian man.
Yeah, I think that was one of the questions that I had. Do we think it was would things have been different when Josephine marries Sweetie, who's also of mixed race? She mentions the differences in their complexions. My husband possesses a fair enough complexion to pass. I do not. So yeah, wherever we go, people assume he's white and that I'm Negro. It was on page 13. So again, it was just saying discuss the notion of passing. And do you think it would have been different if they weren't of mixed race, or Josephine had been the one between them who could pass? Would she have had more success, purchasing properties?
Yeah, I think this is Laurie. One of the interesting interactions I thought in the book, or not one, but was at the barber shop with the patrons, because Sweetie was he was kind of in a catch-22. He needed his wife as a business partner, and she really had better business sense than he did, and the fact that she could save money and spend it wisely, but yet he was being berated by his patrons, but he couldn't. I don't know if I think he was frustrated with it, but he really never stood up for her, which was very frustrating to her, obviously, which is part of the book. But I just wonder how much of that is still true today. That when men, I don't know what's true, and I guess depends on the man and the situation, but what can you say, or what do you feel comfortable saying, and who do you feel comfortable defending, and this is how you behave in that situation. So anyway,
I don't think this is Carrie again. I don't think she would have gotten a big benefit if she could pass and he couldn't. I think if they both could have passed, she might have seen some of it.
You think just because she's a woman, you think?
Yeah, I think because she's a woman, but I also think it's kind of strange in our society how, and especially now with like all this DNA testing, and you can see, they're talking about passing for white. He wasn't passing for white. He was probably at least 90% white.
Right, right.
That wasn't considered, just because he's got a little bit of African American, yet nobody would question my identity. If I tell you I'm 50% Irish, you'd take it for granted.
Right.
Because my skin is white. But if he said he was 50% Irish, but they knew that he had some Negro blood in him, he was considered a Negro, which is just, to me, an interesting dynamic that you don't question somebody who's got a fair complexion that and there could be, many of us could have some African-American blood in us that we don't know about.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah. The whole one drop rule, basically,
Yeah.
It's like if there's one drop of black blood, you are black. Yeah. What about, I thought it was interesting, the author chose, and the author of this book is African American. She chose, I feel like she made a conscious decision to not show maybe all the instances of racism that the couple likely faced. I feel like she was very strategic about the ones that she did share. And so I just felt like they would have experienced more racism than was actually shown in the book, if that makes sense. I don't know. The other thing was with the character of Rosa, who was a white woman, the daughter of a wealthy person in the community, and the friendship that they struck up, I thought was a really interesting dynamic as well.
Well, I found it interesting with Rosa too. A lot of the characters, you didn't really talk about race.
Right.
So you only really knew the race of the person when she would talk about the complexion of their skin. And I felt like purposely, she almost left you wondering, was Rosa really white, or was she African? And it kind of went back and forth, because a couple of times I'm like, wait.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Yeah.
I did too, actually. Yeah.
I thought she was Caucasian because the way she described her hair. She would often talk about people's hair, and I just assumed that was because of the barbershop connection.
Yeah, I think that was the same with the Jenkins too sisters, wasn't it? I don't know that she ever really describe their race, maybe?
She did on the
Um,
Jenkins because they were
Did
former
she?
slaves. And
Oh,
she
okay,
talked
okay,
about how
okay,
they were former
gotcha.
slaves and they tried to get, their master had tried to breed them and it didn't work.
Oh, that's right, Carrie. Sorry, you're right.
But I also think from reading The Personal Librarian, which is slightly later in time period, but one of the things they mentioned in that book was, after the freedom of slaves and the different civil rights acts, that there was actually a brief period where, there were still the groups that wanted to oust every African American, but there was a lot better race relations and intermingling was kind of accepted somewhat as far as, in society, maybe not in marriage so much, but certainly with, frequenting the barbershop. It wasn't like it was forbidden and this was blacks only and this was whites only, that actually came in a few years later where it became a big deal because people were, worried that their rights were going to be.
I was gonna say, yeah, I didn't read the book. I was just listening in, but I was gonna say the time period, like you were saying, I believe it was Carrie, that was I guess if you want to call it the golden age of Reconstruction, in my way I would put it. Things were working, and it's like, but then you have that here in the South, you have that turnaround that happens around the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I think on the coastal areas in North Carolina, they were making progress, but then you had these things like the Wilmington massacre and all that happened that basically set these communities back again. So, and I think like this book is set in her time span. She lived in that time when that kind of progress was being made, and then they were kicked back later on by those massacres and the Jim Crow laws and things like that.
Dwayne, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to add anything here as our history person on the call?
Well, yeah, I can a little bit here. As far as the barber interaction, it's funny that in that time and through much of the 20th century, white patrons would actively go to a black barber because that was one of the things that they would say, okay, I can let a black barber touch my hair because that is one of the things that they do. Your laundry went probably to a black woman if you were upper class white to do it, and you might go to a black barber. That was just one of the things that you saw, that most of the Leary's customers were white, right? And that continued actually through the early 20th century. And I think by the time I was born in the 50s and 60s, that was not necessarily the case. But I know in my hometown, a lot of you've heard of Mom's Mabley, right?
Yeah.
Born in Brevard. Her father was a black barber, and everybody went to him throughout, through the mid 20th century. But anyway, I just have to say that I was a little bit embarrassed as a North Carolina historian that I had actually not heard of Josephine Leary. I think if I lived down there, I probably would have, but I'm glad her story came out, and I'm glad you guys featured this book.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Dwayne, because that's what the author actually found or heard about. Again, she's from North Carolina too, and she said she heard about her in a tweet, and I don't remember exactly what the tweet was or what it was referencing, but she was like, I was actually appalled that here I am, a black woman who's lived in North Carolina my entire life, and I've never heard of this woman. So yeah, that was interesting. And and then we can talk about why that is. Why have we never heard of her? Would we have heard, if she were a man and accomplished that, a black man and accomplished that? Do you think we would have heard of, heard about it or not? Is it just the race? Is it the fact that she was a black woman?
I think we would not have started to hear about her until relatively recently. But I also think we regionalize this. Like
Mhm.
I've read a lot about the Black businesses in Durham. I think a lot of us have.
Mhm.
There have been lots of books written on that. The Black bankers and things like that that really got started in Durham. But we haven't heard much about the coast. And speaking of library books, I'm not certain that we have one of these books. It's called A Voyage to Carolina, Reinterpreting North Carolina History, 2017. And one of the essays in it is one that Alexander cited in her bibliography, Money in the Bank, African American Women, Finance, and Freedom in New Bern, North Carolina, 1868 to 74. And that's actually an article I'd like to read. I checked, just did a cursory check. I don't think we have that book, but
Okay.
it might be one we want to get.
It was
Yeah.
a voyage to Carolina.
Yeah, it's
Dwayne?
called, A New Voyage to Carolina.
Okay.
And you have to have the hyphen because that's the name of another book. You have to have the hyphen, and then Reinterpreting North Carolina History, edited by Ties and Crow.
Okay.
Okay. Yep,
All
writing
right.
that down. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I got it down too.
Something else I wanted to talk about is the type of mother that Josephine was and what she wanted for her daughters. You know, she had two daughters, Clara and Flory. And she, talks about her desire and determination to give them a better life, an easier life, and set them on a strong path for a good future. So, she wants them to be strong, educated, independent. So in what ways did you see Josephine encouraging and, her daughter's curiosity and their interest? And how is that different from probably the status quo of mothering or parenting in general at that time, whether it was a Black family or a white family?
Hey, this is Jessica.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's
Right,
good.
yes, please.
So I thought it was interesting, the children's love for reading and how
Mhm.
she encouraged that, even sometimes when she didn't understand it, like when the daughter was reading recipe books about other cultures. Because I would have thought that it may have been some fear left around that since Josephine herself was in slavery, and the way that at that time they did not want them reading, they did not want them to learn to read. And so I thought it was very unique. It was like almost like a defiance, like not only are we going to read, we're going to read any and everything that we can get our hands on.
Yeah, she was such a good mother. I mean, just being so in tune with with her children, and I really liked at the end talking about the HBCU and just the pride. That was really intriguing to me to hear about her daughter's experience when she got to college. That was very interesting.
I would say too, though, the encouraging with going to college, if you're saying in general, that almost sounds more like an upper class kind of mentality for their girls, Black or white. It's not something everybody always looks and says, oh, my children are going to college, especially at that time. And I thought a lot of it, it was Clara that said it towards the end that I thought told so much, when Clara was like, no, Mom, we could see what you were doing, and we knew you loved us. And even when she said, and Josephine said something about, what about your father? And they're like, yeah, we know he loves us too, but not the same way. Like they really saw the value in what their mother did for them by example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. It's I saw that same kind of mother guilt that I think most mothers or parents in general have to deal with. You do the things she knew she wanted to, or she needed to pursue, these real estate deals and build this legacy for her daughters to make their future brighter. But at the same time, she had guilt about leaving them alone or leaving them with their dad or their grandma, or, not spending as much time with them. She was working in the barbershop, taking care of a home, trying to take care of the kids, pursuing all her properties and then managing her properties. So she, it was just interesting to me to see her, deal with that same guilt that I think most parents end up dealing with. We try to do the right thing for our kids, and then always worry that maybe we're not doing enough or we're not spending enough time with them. But yeah, she was a very hands-on mother, but I think ahead of her time in that way too, because even though you could tell she felt guilty about leaving them sometimes, she knew that it was important for her to do that for their future.
I think some of that goes back too to the multi-generational family. Without the multi-generational family, that would have been a lot more difficult to do. And the fact that, her grandmother was there to help, and her grandmother, I think, was happy to be able to help with that, because when her child was small, she wasn't able to have that kind of freedom because she had to do what her master said.
Yeah, I think that Josephine was able to leave Sweetie when he was abusive to her was pretty remarkable too, because when I was reading the book, I wasn't exactly sure how she was going to react. So I was really surprised. And I think she did that too for her daughters, and she didn't want them in an abusive household. Or when she kicked him out, I suppose, and she started making those legal moves to leave him. So I was really surprised that turned out like that.
Yeah, that's another interesting point, I think, as far as like their relationship. And somebody alluded to it a little bit earlier, but the fact that she was so independent and she was adamant that these properties were in her name. She ended up paying for, the barbershop. All these things were really important to her. And I think that threatened Sweetie's masculinity or whatever, because that was so rare for the time. But I think, again, that just shows that, how different she was for that time period.
But I wonder too, would Sweetie have felt so threatened by everything if he didn't have all the customers and the people he hung out with saying, there's a problem here? Because I don't think Sweetie himself necessarily saw the problem as a real problem, except for his image in the community.
Right.
That was his social media. I mean, we see it a lot today. It's we're judging ourselves by what we see in social media, what we see on TV. We're judging our relationships by that. And those people in that barbershop was his social media. And so it didn't matter whether he was happy. They sowed those seeds of doubt in him, which later on almost jeopardized everything for him. His relationships, his relationship with his daughters, everything that holds real value.
Yeah, I was really hoping that the book would go more into the temperance movement too. I thought that was interesting. She touched on it at the beginning with the Jenkins, I believe it was. I read this book a couple months ago, so I'm maybe a little fuzzy on it. But I was really hoping that we'd hear more about that. But I don't really think we did. I mean, we knew his drinking was a problem. It was alluded to throughout, but it wasn't so much about the actual movement.
And Dwayne could probably speak to this too, as far as like when the actual like temperance movement got underway full force, if it's like just that was the really early beginnings of it, or that happened a little later.
Well, the temperance movement really started in the 1830s and was really going strong by the time this novel was written. In fact, North Carolina actually banned the sale of alcohol well before the nation did.
Wow.
And so, yeah, she would have been involved with other women in the temperance movement. Yes, definitely.
And Dwayne, this was something I was curious about. You may know too. Do you think the way the social political climate that was, showed up in Edenton in this book was the rest of North Carolina pretty much the same way, or was the coastal area a little bit ahead?
Very good question. Very good. I tend to think, and again, not being down there, we tend to regionalize our history. I don't know as much about it as I do this area and the mountains, but yes, and a lot of that is due to a larger African American population, I think.
Okay.
And the fact that in some of these counties, still to this day, there's actually African Americans who are governing themselves, even as early as this. If you read about the era right before 1898, as Tim mentioned, everything changes in 1898. If you read about that era, you had several representatives in the North Carolina legislature from the East, from Wilmington, from up near where Josephine was, and that area. So yeah, it was a little bit ahead. And then of course everything went backwards, as Tim was saying, after 98.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I thought a really interesting part to the book too was when Josephine delivered her speech or her talk at the Edenton Ladies Auxiliary meeting, where she was talking about the societal roles of the modern woman and how they're supposed to act and speak. And she focused in on the financial situation of women, because I think without the financial means, women are stuck, and that still is true today in a lot of times. Without your own financial means, women were not able to leave abusive homes, or, if they didn't know where they, if they didn't have family to rely on, they were kind of stuck. So I think it was a radical idea, as you could see by most of the responses of the women in the crowd, or, that were in attendance, that it was just unheard of to them to think that they would have separate money from their husband, or it was almost like it was unladylike to deal in financial matters.
But she had the financial stuff too in so many different ways. I loved the way too she was supporting her community with everything she did. It wasn't, well, we're going to go and buy this, fancy dress someplace. It was, I'm going to support the local dressmaker.
Right.
And like every time you introduced a new business person, she was going to go support them. Male, female, black, white, it didn't seem to matter. If they were a local business person, we should support them.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting too, when she went to the lawyer, he was a white guy, wasn't he? Wasn't there pictures of like Confederate stuff in the office? I can't.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, but he treated her with respect, right? I mean, I guess she was just well known in the community, but I thought that was an interesting interaction that she and Sweetie had with the lawyer that I didn't know how that was going to turn out either, how respected she would be there. So it's good to have money, I guess, right?
I thought it was interesting that he said that he only did it. He only enrolled because he was looking for a paycheck. And so it had nothing to do with views or opinions or any of the other things that we subscribe to being in having enrolled in the Confederate Army. It was merely a means to an end for him. He needed money. They offered money, therefore he's there. And so I don't think that it was ever a point where I don't think that he was just the type of person to disrespect her as a human. I think that he was the type of person that to respect anybody who's bringing him money.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I wanted to go back and look at Josephine Leary's diaries, and they're actually on that research guide. I don't know if you've seen the link for it, but we've linked to the Duke repository, and all of her diaries are there digitized, so we can read the diaries. But I wanted to go back and see, how those interactions took place in her diaries and how accurate they were in the book. So I just don't know.
We put a link to the research guide in the chat too.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, to what Jessica was saying, there's one point in the book where she talks about, I think it's early on when maybe she's buying her first property, maybe, I'm not sure, but where she talks about, let me see if I can find it real quick. where, but basically it was saying, oh, here it is. Discuss Mr. Charles's racism in the context of Josephine's observation that his greed outweighs his prejudice. So yeah, so when money's involved, sometimes people's principles go by the wayside, and they'll overlook something as long as you're willing to, pay for the privilege.
Well, I think he also got backed into a corner a little bit on that because, originally it was only, half the amount that you had to put
Right.
down and then you could
Right.
pay the rest. And he was like, oh, sorry, it's going to have to be the full amount. And I
Mhm.
think he was thinking, oh, if it's the full amount, they're not going to be able to pay. And then I don't have to sell it.
Exactly. Yeah. And then she shocked him with the with the full amount.
But it also goes to show, I mean, how many times do people, surprise us in our own lives? And we, unconsciously, we start to judge people the minute we see them.
Oh,
And what they
absolutely.
look like, how they dress, how they walk, how they talk, any of that, that we're already starting to make those judgments. And they could be a millionaire for all we know and just not look like it. Kind of like Josephine was, he didn't see her as someone who would have any money or any business sense.
Right. And I think, yeah, so we're talking about her, maybe not, you were talking before about her not, spending the money she was making on, the best dresses maybe for her, or, a new house or whatever. So yeah, you may not necessarily know it by looking at her, how much money she had in her real estate business, because she again was building for the future for her girls, for their legacy.
Yeah, I think when I listened to that YouTube video that you posted earlier, Lisa, in the interview with the author, it struck me again how important it was to formally enslave people to actually own any property of their own. And I think throughout the book, we see that, but it's really crazy, to me, when I think about it now, they own nothing. And so she, at the beginning, when she was able to purchase that land because her, I guess it was her dad, the former master, had given her some money, that just meant the world to her, and she valued it so much when no one else seemed to have placed the same value, or not as many people, and she had the means to do it. She was able to purchase the property, but just going from having nothing to actually having tangible things. And it was so important to her to own the house and not have to rent the house. And Sweetie wanted to put it in the business, but she wanted the actual property that she lived on because it was something she didn't have growing up or previously, or her parents didn't, her grandparents didn't. So, and I don't know, it was just so striking to think about that.
I found it interesting too and I think it happens today too, the if versus when mentality. For me, it was never, if I could buy a house, it was when I would buy a house. And I think with, her background and growing up a slave, it was like, if I can do it, I'm going to do it. It wasn't a given that she would be able to own property. And she wanted to make sure that for her children, it was a given. For her children, it would be when they owned property, not if they could.
Right.
Well, I think a critic could say, hey, her white daddy gave her a great wedding gift, right? But how many of us, if we got $500 for our wedding, would have spent it? Like I would have spent it on a cruise. I would have bought shoes. I would have spent this frivolously. She put the entire amount very cleverly into something that was going to give her money later. And I think that's what set her apart from someone like, me. I don't make good decisions with money. Josephine made great decisions with money, and that affected her entire life.
And not just her life, but her children, her grandchildren, and everyone down the line.
Yeah, again, I think, part of it was just, her personality. She was, born to be like determined, forward thinking, independent. And then again, like, you know, like Laurie was saying, after coming out of slavery and seeing how her mom and grandmother lived, with no choices at all, she was determined to, you know, make as much as she could out of what she had and what she was given.
Yet at the same time, there were several points where she looked back to her ancestors too, and her ancestry, and the naming ceremony, and just even, you know, the herbs that, you know, the healing herbs, that kind of stuff, that she still had a respect for the past.
Right.
And when her daughter wanted to try to cook some of the recipes from the cookbook, she threw in, well, let's try to learn some stuff to cook from our history as well.
Right. Yeah, there's no doubt she was a very, very interesting and accomplished woman, to say the least. Does anybody have anything else specific that stood out to them that they want to bring up?
Yeah, I apologize to everyone that our speaker did not come. We just touched base with her a couple of days ago, but you know, Lisa did a really good job keeping us going today. Yeah, I really don't know where the speaker is, but thank you all for showing your interest in this. If I know Lisa's asking if you have questions, and we can continue, but I just wanted to put my 2 cents in about that. And thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, I do encourage you to check out the links we put in the chat. And one thing I wanted to talk about quickly is, you know, where the book kind of ends. You know, I kind of felt like I wasn't ready for it to end. I wanted to know more about her later life. You know, it kind of ends where she's deciding that she will rebuild after the fire. And then, you know, you have the epilogue where they're having the grand opening of the J.N. Leary building. And there's a picture of that building on the Edenton Historical Commission's page. But what specific questions are you left with? Do you feel there were any important things left unanswered, or a piece of her story that you'd like to know more about?
Well, I would like to know more after 94. And I was taking just a quick look at the papers down at Duke. And again, it's a very quick look, and I haven't looked at them before, but I don't see a whole lot of personal correspondence from Josephine after 94. There's a lot that is from her daughter or to her, but I think that the author, and she didn't say this necessarily, probably had to stop when she stopped getting a lot of personal correspondence from Josephine. Like, I understand that was a good stopping point, that she rebuilt the building and the book was already the size that it is. But I think it would have been good to know a little bit more from Josephine. But that's probably the limitations of the source material.
Right.
But yeah, as Tim mentioned, I would like to know if she had a reaction to what happened in Wilmington in 98, because that affected everyone to some extent, because several people from Wilmington went north and hid in New Bern. They might have made it to Edenton. And what was the reaction to that? But we don't have that. And the other thing is, for all her wealth, it couldn't save Josephine when she got cancer.
Right. Yeah, her story does not end happily.
She did not have insurance, and it was very difficult to get private insurance at the time. And part of her illness, and I was looking at her age, part of her illness today, if she was covered, would have been covered by Medicaid or Medicare.
Right.
And she didn't have that. She got sick, I think, when she was late 50s, early 60s, so it wouldn't quite have kicked in. But she was sick for 7 years before she died. And part of that would have been paid for. And instead, she had to sell all her properties just to pay for medical care. And her children were left with some of her properties being in litigation in order to pay for the medical care. So I don't, that's a sad ending, I think, and something about what it might say for our society in the 1920s,
Right.
how you were just on your own.
I think that would be interesting too, Dwayne, to talking about whether the events around that area maybe have affected her financially and that kind of thing and stuff as well.
Well, unfortunately, that could still happen today. You can get wiped out pretty easily if you're not able to have insurance, or you're in a place that doesn't have good medical care. I mean, that's still true.
Yeah, I thought it was for her to have spent her entire life and put so much of herself into building that legacy in something tangible, the real estate that she could pass on. The fact that she ended up having to sell most of it for her care, it was just really, really sad. But it does not diminish the accomplishments that she achieved during her lifetime at a time when, women, Black women were not only not expected, but, discouraged from trying to, do anything outside the home, basically. So yeah, she was very inspiring and kind of ahead of her time, for sure.
Nikki is with us, Lisa. Did you want to see how she felt about the book or catch her up on anything?
Yeah, Nikki, you want to make any comments? What stood out to you specifically about the book? Or
no, I mean, it was interesting because the places, and I think you guys had touched on them, and thinking about Black women during that time and really women just in general, and then her seeking that property ownership. The other thing that stood out to me was the passing. I don't know if you guys had an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, we did a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, but that was one. I've read several others during that time period where, that was kind of the thing. And in a way, I kind of hated that she was she wasn't too happy with Sweetie and having him using his passing to actually seek out opportunities. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I probably will read it over again just because.
Right.
But I enjoyed it because of those historic points in terms of thinking about where women were in that time and where Black women were during that time.
Oh, absolutely. And talking about the passing again, I think I could see, like Sweetie's struggle and her struggle. You could see where, why not use it if you can? But then on the other hand, a moral dilemma about doing that, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, and so she had the kind of the double, she was, when she was looked at as a Black woman married to a man who was able to pass.
Right.
And then the property ownership, which takes me back to, being a woman during that time and actually, thinking about, I mean, she was thorough and thinking about how she could create that legacy. And she knew the meaning behind creating that legacy in terms of all the studying that she did. She was just, great in terms of, being able to study and figure out how she could acquire these properties and how that she was building on that future.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why I really like, I mean, the book is fiction, but it's so heavily based on the research the author did into the real life of Josephine Leary. And that's something I really like about, excuse me, historical fiction. I think it just adds so much more when it's a real person.
I agree.
And that's why we like libraries so much too, right? And archives. That the accessibility part is really important, and it's really great that her I think it was her grandson, maybe who gave the papers to Duke to keep for all of us. So that's something we can go back and examine, and probably even get other things that we can hold on to. So we like that.
Yeah, and are you guys talking about the Mumbas Act? I think somebody had talked about, when I came in, about the medical pieces of it. So yay.
I think Dwayne may have been talking about that when you came in. We didn't particularly, I don't think we addressed it by the Mumbas Act, though. I don't know what that is.
Well, it kind of goes into the same piece. And there is and Dwayne, you may have seen this on Hulu. Have you seen the, I'll say the documentary on Hulu that talks about the Black Maternal Health Caucus and the Focus? Aftershock, I think that's what it's called. Did you see that, Dwayne?
It is on my Hulu list.
Absolutely.
I'm slow. There's actually a lot of nonfiction out there that I'm slowly getting to. So yeah, it's on my list.
So that's actually when I learned about Mambas and those pieces through the diversity and inclusion committee through the health department. And Ms. Dixon was the one who was talking about it, and she encouraged us to watch Hulu, the documentary that talked about the Black maternal health, I'll say, focus in terms of these Black women who technically were having C-sections and were dying maybe 9 to 10 days after having C-sections because they weren't getting or receiving adequate health care in terms of communication and resources, and really more about communication in terms of where they were in terms of that threshold of not feeling well and kind of, being ignored. And so I just learned about it really within the last month or two. And so, again, tying back into the book, and I think I heard somebody say that, hey, this could happen even now. Well, they just started that one probably back in they started looking at it in about 2018. So recent, we're still kind of here in a way.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Nikki. Yeah.
sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do know what you're talking about now. I just didn't catch it, but yes. Yeah, and she had, when Josephine had her babies in the book, that was interesting too. Thankfully they were healthy, but poor Sweetie was sitting in the bar getting drunk, I think, during all that. So what the heck?
He was.
He
so that's what
was.
you did. I think
Yes.
that's what Ben did, because he even commented. They gave him comments, I think. Well, the two people with him, the brother-in-law who was younger, and then
yes,
I forget the other gentleman, but they said this is kind of what you do because women have been having babies all the time, and they just kind of know what to do,
Right. And I really like that the author made her characters realistic in that way and well-rounded, and none of them were perfect, but you really could take a glimpse into what life was really like. So that she did a good job with that, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, my wife threw up on me when she had a baby. I wasn't sitting in the bar.
I'm gonna start my video back because I want to share this book. So I don't know if I can. It's not gonna show up.
It won't show up because of your screen.
Okay. Well, it's called Money Rock. And it's one of the other books that were part of this North Carolina Reads grant that we received. It's Money Rock, a family story of cocaine, race, and ambition in the New South. And this is going to be our book discussion book for the fall. And actually, Jibby Williams has put us in touch with the person this book is about. She knows him personally, and we're hoping that we will have him come and speak with us on that book discussion. So Just kind of keep your eye out for that in the fall. There are also a few other books that came with that. NC Reads. One is called Under a Gilded Moon, a novel, Game Changers, Dean Smith, Charlie Scott, and the Era That Transformed a Southern College Town. And then Step It Up and Go, the story of North Carolina popular music. We have a handful of copies of a few of those books left. If you're interested, we'll be glad to get one of those for you. And again, just, watch the Everyone email that comes out every Thursday. Watch for the library's newsletter that comes out once per semester, where we'll highlight things like this that we're doing. And if you have an idea for something that you would like for us to look into doing, we're happy to hear about that as well. Thank you so much for coming today and participating in the discussion. We really appreciate it. Check out the links that we put in the chat for our research guide, the Eaton Historical Commission, and the recording of the video with the author. Those were all really interesting resources. But again, yeah, just thank you for coming. We really appreciate it and hope you got something out of this today.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank y'all. And everybody have a great day.